Hello and welcome into the Fog.net podcast. My name is Michael Swain, the Kansas beat writer for 24/7 Sports. I am joined today by Henry Greenstein of the Lawrence Journal World. We're going to talk all things Kansas football preseason camp. Depending on when you're listening to this, KU may have already taken the field for the start of its official preseason training camp. KU practices on Tuesday, and basically the majority of camp will take place over the following 3 weeks. And that's going to be a really busy time for Henry and I covering the team. So we're going to break down kind of some of the things we're looking for heading into camp, some stuff that fans, if you're checking in after the summer, that you should have your eye on. We'll try and cover those things for you. But Henry, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I feel like it's not a college football podcast at this point in time if I don't open with the question about, EA Sports College Football 25. So have you been playing the new game?
Oh, far more than I would care to admit. Of course, I may have just admitted it. But yeah, I'm already on end of season 3 of a dynasty. Again, I'm digging myself a deep hole here. But yes, when I'm done with them, Georgia Southern will be the class of the nation.
I love it. I'm bummed. I pre-ordered the game months ago and then planned a vacation that started like a day after the pre-order came out. And so I played for just a couple games, used KU. Devin Neal is insane. And then went on vacation and had just the biggest FOMO. Obviously loved being outdoors and all that stuff, but I was missed out is what I feel like. And then the last couple of days that I've gotten back into playing it, it's pretty fun. I do a similar thing to you, Henry. Dynasty I did a create your own team. So started with the worst team possible, and I like that type of stuff. So it's a fun game. And look, real football is around the corner. I think for both of us, there's not going to be too much time for playing the video games here in the next couple of weeks. So let's dive in, Henry. We can start with the big picture look at camp for KU. Obviously, it's a busy off season. Any newcomers that for you're most excited to kind of get your eyes on, whether it be freshmen, transfers, anybody you're really interested to see in person on Tuesday as practice starts?
Well, I mean, the obvious salient answer is Bryce Foster, just because for one thing, he's going to be such a striking physical figure. He'll be hard to miss. But also, to see what he looks like in something resembling live action after kind of hearing about him as this mythical figure throughout the summer, to see kind of the rapport he's building with the other offensive linemen, and not just in terms of the drills we get to see, which maybe aren't always that illuminating, but even in terms of how he's getting along with his teammates, the little kind of interactions we see between exercises and all that. People don't arrive in mid-June too often. And if there were anyone who were able to take advantage of a situation like that, it would be him, because he isn't really used to doing spring practice because of his track obligations. But yeah, I'll be watching him. I'll be watching the freshman defensive ends, because we know that the pass rush defensive end is one of the big outstanding questions of this season. And those are kind of the main areas that stand out to me right now, because we did get a look at many of the other newcomers in the spring. But yeah, certainly a lot of intrigue that remains to be resolved between now and a month from today, as we're recording the first game of the season.
Yeah, you're right. And I think I'm really interested with Bryce Foster, watching him line up along some of the other offensive linemen KU has. There was a video that KU posted at some point in the summer. I can't remember, but it was after Bryce had reported, and it had like him standing next to Bryce Cabledew. And obviously, Bryce Cabledew is a very large offensive tackle, and they looked almost the exact same size. And so you're talking about someone, at least listing wise, right? 6'5", 330. We'll see how that roster is updated when we get to practice on Tuesday. But in terms of like interior offensive linemen, you think about Mike Nowitzki, he was listed at 6'5", I think 305, I want to say. You're talking 25 pounds or even 20 pounds on the interior of your offensive line. And I think that is huge, especially when you consider what, Shane Baumgartner looked like in person. Wasn't exactly the most striking physical figure. And to all of a sudden add someone that has SEC experience at that position is really interesting. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Henry. I'm really interested to see how he does. I'll add By Job to the mix. You mentioned defensive ends. Like, someone's going to do an Austin Booker where beginning of camp, it's, we don't know who's going to step up. Then at the end of camp, it's this guy. My money probably would be on By Job, just physically, right? 6'4"-ish, 245. Like, he's got all the physical traits, just hasn't played a lot of football. I feel like that's going to be a big theme of probably the first week of practice is going to be, hey, for these guys like, Deshaun Warner, Dak Brinkley, by Job, those guys, they haven't played a lot of football. And so it's going to be about getting them reps, getting them acclimated. And I think the first week will probably tell a lot about where those guys are at. We can move on to the defensive end, Henry, because this is something that Lance Leipold talked about a little bit at Big 12 Media Days. What did you think of his comments that this might be more of an open rotation rather than here's the starter, here's the number 2, here's the number 3? What do you kind of think about his comments that he made at Big 12 Media Days about that?
Well, they do always say that. I certainly think that rotation will begin to become weighted in some way if, as you suggested, someone like Job does start to seize control, or perhaps Dean Miller, who seems to be kind of the favorite entering camp, even though he doesn't have the same fanfare as all the incoming prospects. But yeah, one of the big tenets of this KU defense has always been the rotational approach they've taken. So it wouldn't be a surprise at all for me to see them continue with that, especially given that they don't have proven players at that spot. But yeah, I'm really excited to see by Job as well, as you mentioned. I think the 245 is what stands out to me there, because I don't know that I expect him to necessarily be measured that well in terms of weight when he first came in, but that's a testament to a year in a Big Ten strength and conditioning program, as well as the work he's done with Sean Cooper. And both of those things together should prepare him well and probably give him a little bit of a leg up as he comes into Matt Gilderslee's program. But yeah, obviously a position that's going to face a lot of scrutiny. And we talk about how great the secondary is going to be this year, but you can only rely on them so much. You got to make their job a little bit easier somehow. And Austin Booker and those guys did a good job last year putting quarterbacks in compromising positions where they were tempted to throw the ball straight to Kobe Bryant or Melo Dotson. And I don't know exactly who's going to do that. Maybe they'll get a little bit more on the interior O-line as well. We hear about, Javier Jarrett won't be a huge piece, probably. He won't be one of the top 3 guys, I wouldn't expect. But we hear about his quick twitch nature and what he can provide from a pass rush standpoint. Those guys, too, do have a role to play, as well as, of course, the strong side defensive ends who we know a bit more about in Jeremy Robinson, Dylan Woodkey.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, I look at the defensive line, and like if Austin Booker had come back, you're talking about a defensive line. You're like, oh my God. Like, you look at the strong side, having Jeremy Robinson, Dylan Woodkey, 2 guys that have played a lot of football, right? Just like you mentioned there with the defensive tackles, you've got DJ Withers, Tommy Dunn, Caleb Taylor, Keenan Caldwell, and Javier Jarrett as kind of your main core group. And Jarrett in the spring game, I thought really showed that twitch that you mentioned there, Henry. Like, I thought he got off the ball really quickly. And that's what if you listen to, Jim Panagos or Taiwo Onatolu, the 2 position coaches, they talk a lot about just getting off the ball. Can you get upfield? And I feel like, those other positions do have that. And at the end, though, I think it does come back to that rush end position, and just can somebody step up? And I don't know who that's going to be yet. And I'm really fascinated to see how they handle that in the first 2-3 weeks of the season, just because, like you mentioned, Dean Miller's been in the program for a couple of years. By Job, Dak, Deshaun, they haven't been in the program for a long time. It's all about, the learning experience. And I think you also made a really good point about the secondary. You can talk about how great it is having guys like Kobe, Mello, Marvin Grant, OJ Burrows. If they have to cover for 6-7 seconds, that's not really going to be super conducive to playing a sticky defense. So for me, it feels like this defensive line and really the weak side defensive end position can just have so much impact on the greater defense, where last year you saw Austin Booker have that great impact and the defense really improved. And now it's a question of, hey, through maybe by committee, can you improve that? I don't know if that's feasible or if I'm even thinking about that the right way, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I think it's going to take time for someone to emerge. I think that the first game against Lindenwood won't be a very good indicator, simply because of the pedigree that Lindenwood has or lacks. And so I think, as you maybe suggested, they will kind of get deep into the season before someone really does become the clear pass rush defensive end, if they ever get that at all. They may not. It may be what they kind of expected last season was going to be before Booker broke out, which was a committee that continues for a prolonged period of time. There's no clear solution. It seemed like Dean Miller for quite a while. It could still end up being Dean Miller, but certainly having by Job and DJ Warner on campus complicates things a bit.
It does, and I mean, look, it's a good problem to have, right? Talented defensive line players, like that is a cream of the crop situation for KU. Elsewhere on defense, any other players you'll have your eye on during camp, or that you're really interested to hear what the coaches have to say about? Maybe we can move away from the defensive line, but anyone in linebacker, corner, safety that you're interested to hear from the coaches about heading into camp?
Well, Cornell Wheeler is an obvious one. I just think because he has such a primary leadership role as the expected Mike linebacker and will be the guy with the headset. But to me, I'm a little more interested in how the other linebacker spots play out, particularly just how much work Marvin Grant has to do at the Hawk or Cinco position, which is something he worked a lot more at in the spring. And then in turn, does that kind of affect the established safety rotation in some way? If you look at it, last year, KU gave extensive snaps to Kenny Logan, Marvin Grant, OJ Burrows, and Jalen Dye had like 20-something defensive snaps. So if they were to hold true to that again, one of the Dye brothers would probably get squeezed out entirely. But I wonder if Marvin Grant spending more time at Cinco maybe opens up a slightly more extensive or expansive safety rotation, like I said, than what they've done in the past. I'm not sure. And I know that some of the other safeties have also spent a little time playing Cinco. So I don't know exactly how that will pan out. And the other guys who are candidates for Hawk linebacker aren't super experienced. You think of Logan Brantley, super promising, and you'd like to see him play a prominent role this year. But, he has more learning to do. It might not be a super immediate thing for him. And, people like Alex Reich, who we only hear about occasionally, but the staff likes him and he could figure into that picture. It's a bit of a mystery, and they don't have a clear player who can stay in different packages like they did with Craig Young.
Yeah, and that's the thing, that made Craig so valuable was the fact that you could really see KU rotate from the different packages where, that Hawk position is the kind of base strong side linebacker spot. Then there's the Cinco that you just mentioned, which is kind of like the hybrid role that a lot of teams play with right now, whether it be a guy that's a safety or an athletic linebacker like Craig was. And even then, Craig at times also played as like a nickel corner, if there was a bigger wide receivers out there. Like, I think sometimes, you look at Craig Young out there and you're like, oh, yeah, did he do this right? Well, he's playing three different roles and he's not coming off the field. And so I think you are right. Like the way that the rotation at that position is handled and how they do substitute, some of those guys. And, Jalen and Devin Dye are two guys that I think will be the next two up at safety behind Grant. And, rotationally, like if OJ's playing well, do you want to rotate him out? Like that's kind of the question I think it comes down to. I think for me, you mentioned Marvin, totally agree. I'm really interested in the third cornerback spot.
Yeah.
And it also says something about where this program is at right now, that we're going into camp and we're like, what are the things you're interested in? Well, the weak side defensive end spot, and then, maybe the Mike linebacker, and maybe like the third corner. Like that, there's not a lot more question marks about this team right now. And I think someone like, Demarius McGee from LSU last year had an injury that kept him out. Really interested to see if he can do it. Obviously, young guys like Jameel Croft are getting some really rave reviews from the KU coaches during spring, and he's got all the physical tools. You watch him at practice, like he looks like someone that could play safety, but he's got that athleticism, the hip flexibility and ability to flip that you look for in a corner. So I think for me, kind of those are the spots. But I like what you said to begin, Henry. I think Cornell Wheeler is going to establish a lot for this KU defense, because think about it too. This isn't 2 years ago, last year, when it's all signing on the sidelines, right? When they got the signs up to signal, he'll have a microphone in the back of his helmet with the new rules. And that's a storyline, I think, as camp goes on, that I'm really interested to hear about, because those rules were expected to pass during spring. So they used it. But now that it's official, like, what's going to happen. So I think for me, like the telecom communications, or whatever you want to call it, the microphone in the back of the helmet, that's a really interesting storyline as well, because it's just going to be new to anyone that's going to be running that Mike linebacker spot.
Yeah, and on the offense, they'll be receiving information about an offense that's a scheme that's still new to everyone. So on both sides of the ball, certainly interesting to watch. And I love how you've keyed in on that storyline for sure. And one more point on cornerback, I think you made a great point in a recent article that, if something just randomly happens, like Kobe Bryant having to miss the first half of a game due to a targeting suspension like last year, they had guys who could step in quite readily, in Kalen Gervin and Quentin Lassiter. Demarius McGee hasn't played a large sample of football in quite some time. The fact that he did play at LSU gives you confidence that he could.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly he has the background and all indications he'll be able to do so. But it might be one of the things where you won't necessarily believe it until you see it. And yeah, I'm eager to see how he figures in there, especially because next year he may be the top cornerback on the entire roster. So
yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot that's going to leave. I tweeted that this weekend, and that just hit me again. You did mention switching to offense, so we can do that. Let's talk coordinator. Obviously, for KU defensively, Brian Borland is back. DK McDonald will be the co-defensive coordinator, but Brian will still call the plays. On offense, there's still the same co-offensive coordinator, Jim Zabrowski, but a new offensive coordinator in Jeff Grimes. This has been something that I think both of us have written plenty about, but I think there are also a lot of fans that jump in at this time of year, right? Basketball season's going on during spring football. There's other stuff going on, but now a lot of focus is on football. What are your expectations for this offense, under a new face, even though a lot of the staff is still the same behind the scenes?
Well, Grimes has talked pretty extensively about wanting to maintain a balance between what's familiar to the players and also incorporating a bit of his own preferences. And I think he's often leaning toward the former category and maintaining what Andy Koldnicki had already set up. He talked about how he's come into situations before as an offensive coordinator where things really needed to be torn down and revamped. This is not one of those. And I think Lance Leipold, when he hired Jeff Grimes, the two came to an arrangement that it really wasn't going to be a fresh start. But I think that as an experienced veteran offensive coach, you will inevitably put your own stamp on something like this. And there are many ways in which I expect that to pan out with Grimes. For one thing, I think we'll see more work under center. That was something you and I both wrote about in the spring. And that has a lot of interesting elements to it. I mean, Cole Bauer took one snap under center last year for a quarterback sneak with Dominic Pooney as the center. That was a one-off thing. Yeah.
Forgot about that.
Yeah, me too, until Cole mentioned it in the spring. So it clearly made an impact on him as well. But yeah, other than that, this has not even remotely been an aspect of anything that a KU offense has done. It'll be new for Jalen Daniels. It'll probably be new for Bryce Foster. Multiple areas in which that could be kind of a sticking point. I don't think it'll be a huge amount of it because it's new, but I think that there's a lot of potential for the KU offense to be more dynamic if it can add a considerable portion of under center stuff. You'll see more screens, you'll see more jet sweeps. And this last point was one that I didn't really think about until Big 12 Media Days, because it seems kind of counterintuitive to what you'd expect out of Jeff Grimes as a tight end guy. But I think because of the personnel or lack thereof that KU has available at tight end, we'll see more two-back sets. That was something that Lance Leipold talked about a little bit, just finding ways to get Devin and Daniel Highshaw onto the field at the same time. Yep. And without kind of a clear-cut number one tight end. To this point, Trevor Cardill could still be the clear-cut number one tight end and have a really productive season. But I think even though Jeff Grimes is a tight end guy, he will, because of personnel, bring more two-back sets than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. As it pertains to Bryce Foster, snapping, it will be new to him. That was something I checked in with someone that covers A&M and was like, hey, under Elko or Jimbo, like, do they do stuff under center? I was like, nope, all shotgun. I was like, great. That'll be an interesting element to keep an eye on as well for Foster, right? Snapping under center. I think you're right, though. Like, I can't wait for Henry when Jeff Grimes calls a screen on like 3rd and 10 in like the third quarter of a one-score game, and everyone loses their minds because that's what screens. I feel like screens are like the magnet for people just to get pissed off about. And I get it. Like when they don't work, they look bad. But when they do work, they really can look good. And I think having someone like Trevor Wilson on the roster, who does have kind of a unique skill set compared to some of those other guys, maybe he's someone that can take advantage of having more screens. Because you think about Luke Grimm, really good route runner. Top end speed is solid, not elite. Lawrence Arnold, good physically. Quentin Skinner, really good long speed. Is he really as wiggly as someone like Trevor Wilson? So that's where I feel like Trevor Wilson, hey, can you have a good camp? Can you put together some really solid practices and put yourself in a spot where then, you can go out there and have a role, even if it is very specific, it's still a role you can have success in. And at the tight end spot, like the injury to Sean Hanukkah is a real bummer because he would have been the guy I think everyone would have been tabbing is, hey, this guy's going to go out there and replace the production left by Mason Fairchild. And if you go back and look at Grimes' Baylor teams, they targeted the tight ends. Like I think last year's Baylor team, the third leading receiver on the team was a tight end, but that dude's also really good. And he's going to go to TCU for his grad year. So I think how that room emerges with Trevor, Jared Casey, Leighton Cure. I almost called him Lincoln. It's Leighton Cure. I'm not going to do that again. I think that room for me is really interesting because you're right. Like if all of a sudden you get through camp and you're like, Leighton Cure's still maybe 6 months away from being ready to be a big time contributor. Or Trevor Cardell is good, but in this package, maybe there are more ways that KU can get creative. And I think that's something where it's going to come down to camp and how things play out.
Yeah, and that'll be another intriguing thing for us to watch. Leighton Cure is another player where you kind of have to think about it from a theoretical standpoint more than anything else, because he has the frame you'd want, but is also a player who had an injury that caused him to miss a whole season, who really wasn't like a hyper frequently targeted player in his one season at Division II level. So just it's all theoretical, like I said. Much with Trevor Cardell, even with Cardell. I mean, we've seen him on the field, but he's never been a high volume target. Even again, a player who has the height and weight you'd look for, who you think could probably be a really devastating blocker at the line of scrimmage too. But the ultimate problem for KU is the tight end they've gotten the most production out of is Jared Casey, who just does not have the prototypical tight end profile. They'll find ways to use him. And Jeff Grimes, actually, I was a little surprised to hear this, talked about having previous players who were similar to Jared Casey at other stops, which was surprising to me just because I feel like Jared Casey is unique in some ways. But that gives me an indication that Jared Casey will still be quite involved. It'll just be interesting to see where exactly he lines up on the field. It'll be different from Kolonicki's preferences, probably.
Yeah, and I think the difference between the two offensive coordinators in terms of like tight end is it just look at who they've recruited.
Yeah.
Kolonicki recruited Carson Brune, who's 6'5", 245, if not more. I had people up in Iowa telling me like they thought he was going to be an offensive tackle. Like he's more of a blocking center tight end that then you're going to teach kind of how to run routes and be really diligent in the way you get open. Where you look at who Grimes has recruited, like in the high school class, Joseph Skipworth, Leighton Cure, guys that are more wide receivers who then you're going to teach how to block, but have that mindset of wanting to get dirty. They don't view themselves as wide receivers. They view themselves as tight ends with the wide receiver skill set. I think everyone can thank Travis Kelce for that. And I think that difference is really interesting because I think someone like Sean Hanika fit that, right? He is more of a wide receiver type of tight end. And that's one of the reasons why he didn't play early at Iowa State. Like I know firsthand, I was there, if the blocking was the issue. And so that's why that injury is more of a bummer because he certainly fits. And I think some of those other tight ends, like how they mix and match will be really interesting. I want to get your take on the running back room. Obviously, Devin Neal is incredibly talented. He's going to have or should have another great season. What do you make of kind of the guys behind, Neal and Highshaw, whether it be Sevion Morrison, Harry Stewart, Johnny Thompson? What are you kind of reading with that group heading into camp?
Yeah, I think Morrison has the most eminently apparent role to play, but it all depends on how healthy he is and how integrated he gets into the new scheme. I think he's shown so much promise since he first arrived, but last year I think only played 3 or so games. And when he was used, it was mostly as a pass catching threat, which is how I would see him being used this year as well, because Neal and Highshaw both won't shy away from contact at all, but Morris is kind of the one guy you want to get on the outside. And so I think that if he's healthy and he picks up things quickly and makes a good showing in camp, he could absolutely be a fixture of this year's KU offense. On the other hand, though, Leipold has said that Harry Stewart has a pretty good chance for playing time as a freshman, which isn't something you'd expect to hear given the depth they have at that position, but I totally see why. He was one of the guys who was the talk of the spring. You look at him and you see a guy who's ready to play at the college level right away. He clearly, even in the spring game, for example, or game, made the impression you'd expect. I'd absolutely expect to see him get playing time, particularly in games that are already out of reach. Maybe they'll have some of those, and that'll be an opportunity. But I think Johnny Thompson gets forgotten a little bit.
Yeah,
he seemed just as impressive in some ways, but I think that because he doesn't have the height that Harry Stewart did, or at least that he wasn't discussed as much at this time last year,
Yeah.
as Harry Stewart now is. I think he gets forgotten to some extent, and I think he will definitely figure into the future picture in the world post Devin Neal going forward. I don't
Yeah.
know that I necessarily see him playing as much of a role this year, but I do think he's a guy to file away because, I mean, he can be shifty, he can contribute, and I think that people maybe aren't thinking about the fact that this room will continue to be good for years afterward, even once Devin Neal's finished making his mark on the KU program.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I think is exciting and obviously cherish watching a guy that is going to end up being the all-time leading rusher, at Kansas. It's also kind of cool to see that room and you're like, you've got your own kind of lightning and thunder combination there with Harry Stewart and Johnny Thompson, because Johnny Thompson's got juice when he runs. Like, he is fast, he is agile, and Harry Stewart's got the speed and more the physicality. So that part is interesting. I think, yeah, hey, Sevion Morrison, can you stay healthy? Can you put together a good camp? And if he does, like, I think he could be a guy that's in contention to be the kickoff return guy, maybe even punt return, and then having, someone else back there with him on kickoff at least. But I think that is easily a role for Sevion. And then I think you're right, like having him as a third down back, maybe having him, if you do go multiple running back sets, you can have a lot of speed on the field with Neal and Morrison at the same time. Like, I think he's someone that is an underrated piece for KU. If he's able to step up, like, you've got another guy in the running back room, another weapon that you have. If he doesn't, all of a sudden, I think you're right. You're looking at Harry Stewart maybe being the third running back as a true freshman. And I don't get too caught up in like freshman red shirts. That's just with running backs, at least. Like, if they're really good, they're going to go to the NFL. If Devin Neal wasn't from Lawrence and didn't have the affinity for the Lawrence or for the KU program and the historical context of it all, he would have gone to the NFL, right? I think, and if he was from Texas or something like that, like, I think he probably would have left. But because Devin is who he is, he's back. And so I think that's something for me where you think about red shirts with running backs. It's like, if they're really elites and they're really, really good, they're not staying for 4 years anyway, at least not nowadays.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. I think that even so, particularly with the fact that you can now play in 4 games, right? I think that will probably be your guiding principle as they go into the season. But if he does well enough with the first 4 opportunities he's given, assuming they don't wait until the end of the season to parcel all those out, I could certainly see them just being like, yeah, why not? Like, why not just keep going with him? Because we've all seen the promise they've displayed. They've seen it more than even we have. And I think that certainly, even on a team that has so many different possible weapons you could give the ball to, so many options at wide receiver, and we just listed 5 possible running backs who could make a difference. This has been a team that has, over the years, been willing to design specific packages for specific players, and they may find the one particular scheme thing that they need Harry Stewart to do.
Exactly. Real quick on special teams, obviously Damon Greaves probably is going to be the starting punter again. Field goal kicking is going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
Obviously it's Owen Pieper-Gertis and Charlie Weinrich, and probably those two, maybe Tabor Allen too. I'm fascinated to see how this field goal kicking thing turns out, because last year Seth Keller started really well, didn't end the season super well. I think teams have figured out that this guy kicks it really low, and they were able to make it, block some field goal kicks, and I think it got into his head a little bit. So I think field goal kicking is really interesting. Do you have a feel maybe for who you think might have an edge going into camp? I got no idea.
Yeah. No, I thought it was going to be Pieper-Gertis for quite some time, just because he's gotten more action overall. But then, Charlie was the one who got the first go at it in the spring showcase, whatever that may mean. For me, I think just the one thing you can't do is keep switching. I was very anti the switching last year because it is different for holders and snappers, for different kickers, even ignoring the fact that they kick with different feet. So, like, there's so much to contend with there. And I just think you have to have one consistent guy.
Yeah.
I think that if you have a power kicker, you should not just limit him to the long-range field goal options, because every time you do that and you're bringing him in after having previously used someone else, it's a different operation entirely. And I think doing that in the Iowa State game last year and having Pieper-Gertis miss the 50-yard field goal shortly before halftime was part of what allowed Iowa State to get back into that game. And if not for a 80-yard touchdown pass that occurred at a very pivotal moment, we might be talking about that one differently. So my point there is field goal kicking obviously carries a great deal of weight, and I just hope that whoever they choose, they actually stick with the choice and have one kicker do it throughout the rest of the season.
Yep, I totally agree. Show them confidence, and until they miss, I don't know, several in a row or just can't do it, that's when you make a move. All right, then biggest thing, biggest story, not biggest storyline, biggest key for KU. What has to happen during preseason camp over the next kind of 3 or so weeks?
I think they need to proceed very similarly with how they did last year. I think they are on a similar schedule to fall camp, and that will help with the consistency. But one thing we hear throughout this program, regardless of circumstance, regardless at what stage in their elevation they've been at, is the importance of taking things the same regardless of what everyone else, people like us out in the world, are saying about them. They've been all about avoiding complacency. I think that needs to come through, and I'm going to sound like a coach here, just like attacking each day the same way and with the same level of ferocity and motivation. I know. But that really is it. Like you can't change the process now just because people are putting Kansas in playoff in the same sentence. I don't know how much we'll be able to glean about their preparation and motivation from what we're able to see. But I think that is very important. And then, of course, the one thing that everyone likes to say, which is Jalen Daniels staying healthy.
I think you nailed it, right? Get Jalen Daniels through camp. Get him through camp healthy. Have everyone else be healthy. I think it was interesting. I was looking back last year through some stuff. There were some like muscular issues with some guys, like soft tissue stuff, but there wasn't anything like guys went down with huge injuries. I think Ron McGee's torn ACL was the only really major one.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's interesting. I think you're right though. Like you hit the nail on the head. Just get through camp healthy. This team is so experienced. That's what has to happen. Get those experienced players to the season feeling healthy, feeling ready to go, because the season is there for KU, right? We've both looked at the schedule. We both talked about it a bajillion times. Like this is the opportunity of like the, oh, I almost cursed. That was not my good. The meter of, really talented, experienced team meets light schedule. You know what I'm talking about. Supply and demand, that type of graph. You can use a different term. I think you all know what I'm talking about. So for KU, like that's what it comes down to. Can you get those players to the start of the season healthy, ready to go, ready to attack it? Because if they can, then I think this thing is definitely there for KU to take it.
Yeah. I think one thing that is appearing more and more in this era of conference realignment is more drastically misbalanced schedules between teams in the same conference. And while KU is a great team with a huge amount of returning experience, the reason why people have them in the championship conversation is largely due to the fact that they don't play Oklahoma State, they don't play Utah, they don't play Arizona. So as you said, they need to show up for the games they do have fully intact, take advantage of the opportunity that's available to them.
Awesome. That's what I got for you, Henry. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. For any KU fans that don't know your stuff, I mean, how could you miss it? Where can they find you?
Yeah, the Lawrence Journal World paper and digital versions, as well as kusports.com for our KU-specific stuff. I really appreciate you having me, Michael. You do such great work, and as I've often said, you have the hardest job of anyone on this beat, and you do it quite well. So thank you for having me.
Oh, of course, man. And I can't wait. Make sure you're staying tuned to fog.net for all sorts of camp coverage. Plenty of VIP updates coming your way all throughout camp. Roster update coming on Tuesday. That's going to create a lot of content for us. Thank you, as always, for listening to the podcast as well. We'll have plenty more to come throughout the course of camp. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you like the video, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps us out with the old algorithm. Lets us reach more Kansas fans. And if you're listening on your podcast platform of choice, make sure you leave in 5-star reviews. Thank you all, as always, for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.